Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gary, as always. Thank you to everyone for joining. So I want to move on our discussion because we spent quite a lot of time talking about the almanas litver element of things. So I want to move it on to looking at the share of state tefillas, though this will get us back to thinking again about the relationship between the melachot of Koreah and the melachot of Tofer. So just to give the background, the Mishnah in Ein Gimel Amud Aleph told us that the share of tefillah is hatofer shtei tefillas, and when it came to Koreah, it also mentioned ha-Koreah almanas litver, and then in brackets, depending on the gesa, shtei tefillas. So certainly with respect to Tofer, the share is shtei tefillas. And with respect to Koreah, apparently, depending on gesos, the geso is also that you need shtei tefillas. Now, we could spend time looking at Kisvei Yodis and manuscripts and working out which is the correct geso. The truth is there's both manuscript versions around. But I want to try and look at it after all that from the conceptual side. What is this discussion around what the share of Koreah is? But in order to do that, we'll have to first do a little bit of chazorah on understanding what the share of shtei tefillas is with respect to Tofer. Why is it that you're only chayav for Tofer if you are Tofer shtei tefillas? And this is really asked by, well, Tosfos on Ein Gimel Amud Aleph, Divrei HaMaschil Ha'oser, says a very brief comment. Tzorich lefarish, Loma pirish kanu be'oreg or be'teo be'chofer be'kosev share tefei b'shah. So the Mishnah on Ein Gimel Amud Aleph lists lamatas melachos. With most of the melachos, it doesn't tell us what the share of the melacha is. Tosfos asks, why is it that with a handful of melachos, it lists what the share is, and then Tosfos gives a useful summary of which melachos, bote nirin, which is a weaving melacha, oreg with weaving itself, petzea, chofer, Tofer, stitching, kosev, etc. So there's a handful of melachos where it gives the share, and Tosfos just a sorach kaparish one needs to explain, which is another way of saying Tosfos doesn't answer the question. What do we see though? Tosfos' assumption is that this is a regular share, like with all the shiurim that you have in all the lamatas melachos. It's a regular share for the melacha. And Tosfos simply wonders why the Mishnah spells out the share for some melachos and not for other melachos. Now, what is the concept of a share with all melachos? Well, broadly speaking, we saw in the sugya of Ein Daled Amud Aleph, for those who are with us right at the start when we started learning Shabbos, that the concept of a share is a measure, meaning to say, it's not that without the share you haven't done the act. It's not a qualitative description that defines what I'm doing. It's simply a quantitative description. How much of that have I done? So if I eat half the kazayas of chometz on Pesach, I have eaten chometz on Pesach, I just haven't done enough of a quantity for me to be chayav for it. It's not that if I have less of that quantity, I haven't done the act at all. I've done it, but there's insufficient quantity. So it's a quantitative failure rather than a qualitative one. Now, you could imagine a threshold where it ceases to be the act at all. So let's say, for example, on Shabbos, there's a share of carrying, which is the share of the melacha, a certain quantity of food. Let's say I carry less than that quantity, so I have done the melacha, I just haven't done enough of the melacha to be chayav for it. However, there would probably be a threshold at which point we would argue that you haven't done the melacha at all because it's so insignificant. So probably as we walk along in our pockets, we all have little fluffs and little bits of fluff of dust and the like. And that wouldn't be the melacha at all because it is below any threshold whatsoever. It has no significance at all. So this is the concept of a share. A share is quantitative rather than qualitative. It doesn't mean that I haven't done the act at all. I've done it, but I just haven't done enough to be chayiv. And based on that, we saw in the sugya of Ein Daled Amud Aleph that chatzi share is also, and according to one opinion, even also in Torah. That's what Rashi there said on Ein Daled Amud Aleph. that chatzi shear is also in our Torah. If I do chatzi shear, I've still done the melacha. The pasuk says, "Lo sa'asek melacha." So I've transgressed the law. I'm not chayiv because with chiyuvim we have our Halacha Moshe Sinai, which tells me the concept of a shear. So Tosfos assumes that all lamatas melachos have shiurim, and he wonders why these particular melachos are singled out as being the ones where the shear is mentioned. Which leads us to a potential answer to Tosfos' question. For those who joined a little late, we're looking at Tosfos on Gimel and Dalef Tifnei Maschal Oser. Very briefly, we're trying to understand the shear of shtei tefiras, 2 stitches with tofa, and Tosfos assumes this is the shear like all others. Now we could answer the question, and this answer is brought in many of the Achronim, including the Minchas Chinuch, by disagreeing with Tosfos' assumption. It is possible to argue that the unique quality of these melachas is that this condition, let's use our melacha as an example, of shtei tefiras, or kosev, for example, where you have to write 2 letters, is that the quantity of 2 letters isn't just a shear, a measure of the quantity required, but it's qualitative. Without it, it isn't the melacha at all. It's descriptive. It's how much of the melacha I've done. It needs a descriptive quality to it. In order to be the melacha, I have to have done this amount. So normally speaking, shiurim are just quantitative. If I carry out, if I eat half a gazayis, I've still done the issa, I've still done the act, I just haven't done enough of it to be chayav. But when it comes to 2 stitches, without those 2 stitches, it qualitatively isn't a sufficient join at all. And we can hear the intuition of that. 2 stitches joins it along a length. 1 stitch is really just a pinprick. It's just on 1 point. There's not enough of a joining to make a joining. 2 letters convey certain information. 1 letter in general doesn't convey sufficient information to be considered the melacha at all. And the nafkamina, the distinction between these 2 models, would be the issue of chatzi shear. Chatzi shear makes sense when this is a shear, a measure. The answer we're suggesting to Tosfos' question, which is not what Tosfos holds, by the way, because Tosfos doesn't give this answer. But Tosfos asks, why does the Mishnah single out the shiurim with 5 melachos and with none of the rest? The answer would be because with these 5 melachos, this is part of the description of the melacha. It's not just a shear. So with respect to carrying, how much I carry is a shear. So the Mishnah is listing the melacha. It doesn't list all the halachos of the melacha. Otherwise, the Mishnah would be the length of the whole of Masechet Shabbat. The Mishnah lists the melachos, and then you have to learn the rest of Masechet Shabbat to learn all the dinim. However, when it says tofa shtei tefiras, that is the description of the melacha. The melacha is tofa shtei tefiras, because if I'm tofa tefira achas, that isn't the melacha at all. So this is an answer to Tosfos' question, and conceptually it's a very important one, because in that case, chatzi shear, at least min haTorah, would be mutter. When it comes to carrying, if I carry half a kazayis or half a shear rather, if I carry half a measure, I've still done the melach, I just haven't done the shear, so it would be chatzi shear also, and also min haTorah. Whereas when it comes to writing or to sewing, if I do 1 pinprick stitch, just 1 through, there's nothing double about it, this wouldn't be a chatzi shear. I simply haven't done the melacha, and at least as far as Torah law is concerned, it would be mutter. So this conceptual way of understanding what the point of this shtei tefiras is, what the logic, what the rationale, what the concept of the shtei tefiras is, would have a very significant effect la halacha. There is one other example of this with which you may be familiar, and then I'll pause, which is the halacha of marvi daled amos. I don't want to go into the whole of Hilchos Hotzah. In Mitzvah Hashem together we will learn Hotzah one day. But Hotzah consists of 2 scenarios, either moving from Rishus Rabbin to Rishus Yochid or the reverse. Let's say in simplest example, from inside my house to the street, or from the street into my house, changing Rishus, or within Rishus Rabbin being Marvi Daled Amos, carrying something Daled Amos. Now Marvi Daled Amos is not a shear. It's not that I need to do a quantity to do the melacha. It's the concept of the melacha. Moving along a Rishus Rabbin, why is it awesome? Why is it forbidden? Why is it melacha? I haven't moved Rishus. The answer is moving Daled Amos is changing the location. And therefore, if I move 3.5 amos, I haven't done the melacha at all, and therefore it's mutter. It's not just a measure, it's a qualitative description. That's a mashal of this idea. And this Minchas Chinuch is suggesting, it's not Minchas Chinuch's own idea, it comes from earlier Achronim also, he quotes it, he's suggesting an answer to Tosfos' question that all the cases where the Mishnah lists the measure, it's because it's descriptive of the melacha as opposed to just a shear. And that's a very beautiful answer because it helps us understand the Mishnah is naming each melacha. The name of the melacha tofa isn't just tofa, it's tofa shtei tefilas, because without that, it's not the melacha at all. Sorry, Jeffrey.
But even if you hold the shear is quantitative, similar to what you were saying with having a few crumbs in your pocket, surely everyone holds at some point there is a quality to it as well.
Yes, I agree. There is a point where something becomes so little that it has no significance at all. But the point of a shear is it hasn't crossed that threshold. Where would be the threshold? You'd have to, when it becomes a crumb or a speck of dust or something like that. If you carry a half shear on Shabbos, you're still carrying something significant, just not significant enough to be chayav for. But you're still done an act of carrying, you've still moved an object from place to place, as opposed to a point where something ceases to become an object. Let me give you another example of this. In Yonos Yomas, obviously, at the moment now, as all our Bonim, I'm doing Chazorah and Hilchos Pesach. So there's a halacha on Pesach that afilu be'elef bottle, chometz doesn't become bottle. However, there comes a point where 1 in 1,000 isn't bottle, but 1 in 10 million would be bottle. If someone dropped a crumb into the Kinneret, which is Israel's main reservoir, on Pesach, we wouldn't say that all drinking water is also in Israel, because the level of bittul there isn't 1 in 1,000, it's 1 in a billion. The fact that when I drink the water, there's a molecule of chometz in the water, well, that's always the case. You can never avoid that sort of thing. That ceases to be a sheer question, and it becomes just of no significance whatsoever. So, of course, there's a point where malacha where the quantity becomes so little that it ceases to have any significance at all. That's not the concept of shiurim. When I haven't, chatzi shear, also in our Torah, as we saw in Ayin Daled Zomid Aleph, means I've still done the same act. I just haven't done enough of it to be chayiv. Okay, so this is a good answer to the question, and this is the first introductory comments I want to say about tofa. I believe, to the best of my memory, we did not discuss this when we actually learned tofa, and we probably should have. So I'm pleased this is a chance to make it up. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the Rishonim. There is evidence both ways from very, very classic sources about these two models. It appears to me that this probably goes back to being a machlokas tanoim already, this concept, whether shtei tefilas is just a shear, or whether shtei tefilas is a description of the melacha. It would be good in the Mishnah if we learned it was descriptive, qualitative, rather than just quantitative, but there would appear to be a significant amount of discussion around this. I'll just give you a couple of the sources, but I don't want to go through all the sources. There is a Tosefta in Beitza, Perik Dalet, Mishnah base, Halacha base, in which the Tosefta seems to assume with Kaisev that if you write one letter, it is not Osam in HaTorah, it's only Osam Drabonon, which would appear to suggest that the Tosefta buys into this theory that writing one letter, it's not just sheer, but you haven't done qualitatively the malacha. There's a Toras Koyanim, which is another source in the Tanoim that says explicitly not like that. It says if you write one letter, it is Osam in HaTorah. In other words, it is a concept of Chatzi Shear. So what would the machlokas be? Is writing one letter, everyone agrees writing one letter is not chayiv. You have to write 2 letters to be chayiv, that's a Mishnah. But what happens if you write one letter? Is it Chatzi Shear Osam in HaTorah, the view of the Toras Koyanim, or no? And as far as Torah law is concerned, it's mutter. Why would there be this debate? The same discussion as we've just now had. Is writing one letter lacking quantitatively? I've done the malacha, I just haven't done enough of it to be chayiv. But the Torah said, "Lo sasa kol malacha," this is asa. Well, no, writing one letter isn't the malacha at all, because it's a qualitative description of the malacha, as per the diuk in the Mishnah, which seems to imply that writing one letter is part of the description of the malacha. So I don't want to go through all the sources now, but there's an extensive, seems to be extensive list of Rishonim and Achronim, and even, as I said, Tanoim in the various sources from the time of the Mishnah that seem to debate this point. So I'm not going to try and resolve it here, other than to say this is a machlokas that has significant nafkamina halacha. Okay, so this is with respect to Tefira. In a moment, I want to now speak about how we apply this to Koreah. But before I do so, I'll just pause if anyone wants to any thoughts about this.
Please.
Yes.
The text we looked at earlier related this idea of shtei tefirot also to the toldot of gluing things together.
Yes.
I just couldn't get my head around how two tefirot relates to glue.
Okay, so I also can't, and we will discuss that either in this year or the next year. It's a very, very good point. So just to, I guess, box Gary's question into a little box so we can put it to the sides that we don't need yet to focus on it. We are aware that besides tofer, there are other forms of joining things together, such as medabik shtei nioris, gluing paper together, and similarly and symmetrically with Koreah, there are forms of Koreah which are unstitching or tearing stitches, and forms of Koreah which are ripping apart glued substances, for example. So we are going to have to eventually deal with the complication of how two stitches relate to the non-tefira type scenarios. I'm going to, and indeed this gets us back to the mess of what the relationship between these and Koreah and tofer themselves are. Is this a relationship of Av and Tolda, or two others, or they're identical melachos? Let's shove that all in a box and place it in the corner for now, just because otherwise we'll become overwhelmed. And let's just talk about classic tofer, though we are absolutely going to have to get back to it. There's going to be no way to avoid this question. However, for now, just I can't cope with it, so let's just push it aside, and we're just going to talk about classic tofer and classic Koreah. So,
Can I ask,
yes, Martin, sorry, yeah.
is that a bit parallel, the sort of the shiur being spelled out in the name of the malacha and that being the malacha to Koreah almanat litfor? And is there to the same people who say that really means literally the only malacha that you're doing is when you're doing it litfor, also say that the shiur is the name of the malacha rather than a shiur, as it were?
The answer is no, though it'd be nice if the answer was yes. Intuitively, the most beautiful reading in the Mishnah would be that tofer shtei tefirus is the description of the malacha, and that Koreah manas litfor, that would be the description of the malacha, and then we would have a very nice Mishnah, in which the Mishnah simply lists the 39 malachas, and any additional details or conditions it attaches to the malacha is part of the description of the malacha, rather than side details. Rather than a messier model in which the Mishnah lists 39 malachas, and for some arbitrary reason, for a few malachas decides to spell out how to avoid side issues on the kalkel, like on manas mitzvah, or what the share of the malacha is. So it'd be nice if we could read the Mishnah that way. Now, Tosfos is a case in point in which Tosfos' example isn't. I can't say he's inconsistent in this, but he's unwilling to go down there, because Tosfos Divrei Maskal HaKosher, I argued against the Biur Halacha, but as per Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that Tosfos is of the opinion that Koreah almanas litfor, the almanases in the Mishnah, are descriptive of what the malacha is, as opposed to just avoiding issues on the kalkel. That's why I argued in Tosfos. Now, if that is correct, and Rabbi Akiva Eiger certainly thinks it's correct, though the Biur Halacha doesn't, Tosfos assumes that Koreah almanas litfor is the description of the malacha, not the Mishnah coming to resolve a side issue on the kalkel, it's the core description of the malacha. However, when it comes to the shiur of base tefiras, Tosfos doesn't say that. Tosfos leaves it as a question. He says, I don't understand, that's Tosfos doing Maskal HaOser. Tosfos, I'm turning sideways just because my piece of paper with the Gemara is on the side. Tosfos says, HaOser, in Tosfos doing Maskal HaOser, Tosfos says this is part of the core description. Sorry, he asks, why does the Mishnah list these shiurim and not for these 5 malachas and not for any other malachas? So Tosfos evidently is not there willing to go down the path of saying this is descriptive to the malacha. Now that's not because Tosfos is inconsistent. He knew how to read the Mishnah, and presumably he was tempted by the possibility of the Minchas Chinuch of saying this is part of the core description of the malacha. Let me rephrase this differently. Why does Tosfos not answer that? Why does Tosfos not say? Tosfos asks the question, why does it list the measure of 5 malachas and none of the other malachas? When it comes to Kosev, it says 2 letters. When it comes to tofer, it says 2 stitches, and not with other malachas. Just as I don't know, sorry for the Farish, you need to explain it, you need to find some explanation. He doesn't tell us what the explanation is. Why not? He evidently isn't that satisfied with the idea that this is descriptive, this is qualitative, not quantitative. Why not? No idea. He didn't think it made sense. He doesn't think this is correct. He doesn't think that the idea of a measure being qualitative and part of the description of the malacha makes sense. He thinks, look, if the malacha of tofer is attaching something with 2 stitches, then attaching 1 stitch is chatzi shir. If writing is 2 letters, which conveys information, then writing with 1 letter is half of that. It's conveying 1 letter's worth of information. How on earth can that stop that being the malacha? So Tosfos didn't understand the the logic, the rationale of the Minchas Chinuch's model. He didn't think it made sense. And therefore, Tosfos prefers to leave the question unanswered rather than give a poor answer. This is a klal in Derech HaLimud. Better not to give an answer than to give a poor answer. And therefore, Tosfos is unwilling to go down that route, and therefore he leaves it as difficult. He says that he doesn't know why the Mishnah makes it out to be descriptive when clearly it isn't, because he didn't think that descriptive made sense in this context. Okay, so that's with respect to Tofer. Now, what's with respect to Koreah? And Koreah, unfortunately, is much more complicated than Tofer, because we have to deal with Koreah itself. Koreah has all the complications of Tofer. It also has the complications of the relationship between Koreah and Tofer, and to what degree they're linked and to what degree they're not. And we saw this in the last few Shiurim. Koreah may be Almanas Litzvah or may not. It may just be any gluing. And then we also have the problem of the non-stitching type Koreah that we'll need to address also. So what can we say about Koreah? So again, just to keep things simple, because I found myself getting fairly quickly overwhelmed with this topic, let's start off with the clearer sources and then try and work our way through them. And I'll remind you, by the way, because we're not going to finish this off today, if you haven't done so already, on the source sheet that I gave out on Koreah, right near the end, the last quarter of the page on the source sheet, I printed the Rambam, which we're going to look at now, and then I printed various references to earlier sources. I said, have a look at the Mishnah Kufay Amud Aleph that's printed earlier in source 4. Have a look at the Biur Halacha printed in source 7. And then I referenced you back to the sugya of Tofer and the Mishnah Masechet Shabbat that deals with sharpness. So please, if you haven't done so already, in advance of next year, do chazorah on what we said, particularly around the Mishnah Klaim that talks about stitching with respect to sharpness, vis-a-vis stitching with respect to Shabbos, because we will need to look at these sources. But for the purpose of today, let's just have a look at the Rambam. So the Rambam, in fact, I'm going to rejig the Shiur to look at the Rambam and then to address Gary's point, because given the time available, 7 minutes will be enough for that, so I'll change the order. So the Rambam I printed over here is the Rambam in Perik Yud, Halacha Yud. And the Rambam says as follows: HaKoreah k'dei litva shtei tfiras, almanas litva shtei tfiras chayiv. Someone who's Koreah in order to sew 2 stitches, in condition to sew 2 stitches, is chayiv. And then he carries on, HaKoreah latzida, if you're tearing to damage something, a potter, because it's mekalkel, and then Koreah b'chamoso al ha'meis is chayiv, etc., as we've seen this Rambam extensively before. So what on earth does the Rambam mean? HaKoreah kedei litva shtei tfiras, almanas litva shtei tfiras. So the translation of the Rambam is that kedei here doesn't mean in order, in the sense of intentionality. It means in order in the sense of sufficiency. So HaKoreah kedei litva shtei tfiras means if you sew a sufficient quantity to sew 2 stitches, in order to sew 2 stitches. So the Rambam is saying there are 2 conditions with respect to Koreah. Condition number 1 is your intentionality, which is to sew, in order to sew 2 stitches, which is really our Mishnah of Almanas. And condition number 2 is the quantity of how much you tear. You have to tear 2 stitch worths of that. What is the source that you need to tear 2 stitch worths of stitches in order to be chayiv? Well, the source is either our Mishnah itself, in which the girsa is Koreah almanas litzva shtei tfiras. We saw that's in brackets in our Mishnah, and that may be a source. And the other source is the Mishnah in Daf Kufay, in which the Mishnah again spells out the Shiur of shtei tfiras. So the Rambam learns that you need to tear 2 stitches in order, a length of 2 stitches, in order to sew 2 stitches. Now, why wouldn't it be enough to merely say that you need to tear in order to sew 2 stitches? Because if your intentionality of the tearing is in order to sew 2 stitches, in order to sew 2 stitches, then surely the amount you tore must be 2 stitch worths also, because if you don't tear 2 stitches of length, space to do 2 stitches, how can you sew 2 stitches? And the answer, as pointed out by Rabbi Koreah in an example of classic Rabbi Koreah clear thinking, is that it would be possible to tear 1 stitch worth of tearing in order to sew 2 stitches. How so? Because we've seen already, the Gemara explains that the purpose of the tearing is in order to get a good amount to resew. But your real purpose is to resew. So a garment has torn and you need to resew it. You maybe need to tear it a little bit more in order to align the pieces probably. So Koreah says it's possible that if you have something which is already torn 1 stitch length, you can tear it a 2nd stitch length in order then to resew both stitch lengths. So you could have understood that the melacha of Koreah is irrespective of how much I tear, as long as I have intentionality to use the space created to sew 2 stitches. In other words, to put this differently, what the Rambam, as pointed out by Rabbi Koreah, is noticing is that we shouldn't confuse the fact that Koreah has to be almanas litvar with the need to tear 2 stitch lengths. It would have conceivably been possible to say that you are chayav for Koreah even if you tear less than 2 stitch lengths, even though the condition of Koreah is that it has to be almanas litvar shtei tefilas. So just to summarize, the Mishnah tells us that it has to be almanas litvar shtei tefilas. The Mishnah tells us that you are only chayav for Koreah if you're intending to sew 2 stitches. But it isn't inherent in that the amount of tearing that I'm actually doing is 2 stitch lengths. It's possible that the amount of tearing I'm actually doing is less than 2 stitch lengths because the garment was already torn somewhat and I only tear 1 stitch length, but I'm doing that in order to sew 2 stitches. So points out Rabbi Koreah in the reading of the Rambam, and the Chura, again, Rabbi Koreah doesn't need my agreement, the Chura, this is what the Rambam means, and this is the nuance that the Rambam is pointing out. And another way to put this is that even in our Gesa in the Mishnah, we need to consider where's the comma. The Mishnah says, "Koreah almanas litvar shtei tefilas." Is it someone who tears in order to sew 2 stitches? Or is it someone who tears in order to sew 2 stitches? In other words, is it the amount I tear that has to be 2 stitches? Or is it the amount I tear can be any amount as long as it's in condition to sew 2 stitches? Now, the logic of not going like the Rambam and Rabbi Koreah would be beautiful. Koreah is a preparatory melachot to tofa. So I have to tear in order to sew 2 stitches. But why do I have to tear 2 stitches worth? But the Rambam doesn't go like that. Rabbi Koreah doesn't go like that. They add in this additional chiddush that I'm only chayav for Koreah when I tear 2 stitches worth in order to sew 2 stitches, possibly putting the comma in between the two. Had Koreah almanas litvar, and I have to tear 2 stitches. So Rabbi Koreah and really the Rambam, in a beautiful example of clear thought, understand there's 2 separate conditions on here. How much I have to tear, answer is 2 stitches, in order to do what? In order to sew 2 stitches. But now we are left with the puzzle of why is this case? Why does Koreah have the shear? And then we would lead to Gary's question, how would this apply to non-restitching scenarios of Koreah?
Rabbi Zobin, could I ask?
Yes.
You could sew your 2 stitches virtually on top of one another. So how can there be a length? How can a length of the tear, how can it work?
On a practical level, I'm no seamstress, but just thinking theoretically, if 1 stitch takes up X, then 2 stitches takes up 2X. In other words, we're talking about very minimal lengths here because threads are very thin things. There has to be some gap between the 2. Otherwise, I would literally be going out of the same hole I went into and no stitch would occur.
Only if the next one.
Some amount of fabric where there's a gap. And therefore, in principle, in Hilchos Shabbos, I'm only chayav if I do 2 stitches, and I'm only chayav if I tear those 2 stitches. On a practical level, would you be advised to tear 1 stitch worth if it turns out that Chatzi shear isn't applicable over here? Well, clearly not. But in principle, the concept of shear is always, the Gemara says that all shiurim have an inherent ridiculousness to them, because a shear by definition is a border, and a border by definition means that an infinitesimally small change is the threshold I cross between chayiv and potter, or effective and ineffective. If I dip in the Gemara's example is if I dip in a mikveh, 40 minus a quarter, minus a micro millimeter, liter of quantity, I have not rendered an efficient tahara. And if it has this, if it's 40 sar, without that lack of a microliter, then I have done an effective tefillah. The Gemara uses this to explain why all Shiurim Halacha and Moshe Sinai. The concept of needing a measure and a quantity is a reasonable one, but it's always going to be somewhat arbitrary where the border is drawn. All legal systems have to have a cutoff point, and there has to be a threshold beyond where you step over, and that threshold is always arbitrary by nature. It's always a matter not of a millimeter, but of 1 over infinity of a meter. It's always a fraction that is the point of the threshold. I should tell you, by the way, this is one of the most interesting things of halacha. In the modern mind, we take these ideas intuitively. We understand there has to be borders. In the ancient world, there was no such concept. People were happy to leave things fluffy and say, over here you're chayv, over here you're patur, and in the middle we'll work it out. As far as we know, in the study of thought processes, it was the halachic system that introduced this concept. It's only in halacha that halacha is the first time you see the atomization of concepts, the idea of drawing discrete lines. Even the idea of borders between countries was not an intuitive idea. When we read the Parshas in Masechet and Pinchas and other places where the Torah delineates the borders of Eretz Yisrael, it's only because we're thinking Jewishly, because we see something existential about what is Eretz Yisrael and what isn't with respect to Kedushas, Haaretz, whatever it is, that there needs to be a border. If there wasn't, why bother drawing a border? Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael, Egypt is Egypt, and in between is the Sinai Desert that no one really cares anything about. No one lives there anyway. It's just not a mocking issue, so who cares exactly where you draw the line? It's an halachic system which takes, it sort of sees the world as existential. It sees things as fundamental and intrinsic, where the concept of a border becomes apparent. In the real world, has there ever been any case where a din Torah has gone to Beis Din, where the question of debate over the Eidim is, did this person tear 1 stitch or 2 stitches? I've got no idea. Because you're right, the difference is microscopic. But nonetheless, in principle, this is the concept that we're discussing. At the moment, I'm reading a very interesting book about the difference between Eastern and Western ways of thinking, and this is one of the areas where Judaism has influenced the West incredibly so. Atomization of thinking, and there's pros and cons in thinking this way, but this is how halacha works.
I'm sorry, I know we've run over time. Are you happy to take on the question?
Yes, yeah, I do. I'm not in a rush today. No matter if
I can't even understand what the concept is of having a shear of tofer which matches that of Koreah, because by definition, if you are stitching a tear with a minimum 2 tefillos, which is an in and out, that is a horizontal stitch against a vertical tear. I can't understand what that means even.
So I don't know, and I have to tell you, I'm also puzzled here as to the thickness of the thread and how that comes into things with respect to Koreah. So with tofer, it's not an issue because you just have to physically do an in and an out. When it comes to Koreah, what happens if I'm tearing a thin thread with intentionality to resew it with a thick thread, for example, because that's all I have. So would the shear be determined by the length I'm tearing or the length I'm planning to restitch? However, in principle, whether a stitch is horizontal or vertical along the length or along the width, I think you would need the same gap in between to ensure that there's enough for it to be toe-faced to seize hold without just going through the same hole again.
But it's not determined. It doesn't determine on the length of the tear, because the length of the tear is going in the opposite direction.
I don't think that makes a difference, though. Well, sorry, are you asking conceptually on why you need 2 stitches, or are you asking practically?
I'm asking conceptually why the shear of restitching can be connected to the Koreah at all.
Oh, okay, sorry. So you're correct, and this is another way of bringing out the point of Rabbi Craig and the Rambam, because the length that you need to tear is the length of the pre-existing stitching, and the length that al-manaslit for is the length of the stitching that you're setting out to make. And the stitching you're setting out to make is presumably width, horizontal across the tear, whereas the length that you're tearing is presumably vertical along the length of the tear. So you're correct. This brings out the point that the 2 conditions of al-manas litzvah and kadei litzvah in the language of the Rambam are not identical. Until I saw the Rambam and Rabbi Kiva, I'm not binochis. I'm not understood this point, that it's not inherent in the intention to tear, the fact that you need to tear such a length. But you're right, this is bringing out the same point again. They're not the same stitches that you're doing. The stitches you're unraveling or may well be different to the stitches you're reading. They may not be. I mean, you could imagine scenarios where you're tearing horizontal stitches and restitching horizontal stitches, but it doesn't have to be that way, yeah?
Thanks.
Okay, so I wish everyone a good day, and thank you as always for joining. I look forward to continuing this topic on Tuesday. And again, I'll just appeal to everyone because I want to move on to the next sugya. Please have a look at this Rambam, and also have a look at the bottom third of the last page on the source sheet that I already gave out, which referenced the previous source sheet in the Mishnah in Kalayim also.
Thank you.
Thank you.